All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Pat Opet. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of JPMorgan Chase. I want to first extend a big thank you to the Philly Fed for having us. This is such a unique opportunity to have the CISOs of the three largest cloud service providers here with us, and probably the most prominent leading voices on modern security today in the country. Let me briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll get right into it. Just to my left is Chris Betts, CISO from Amazon Web Services. Chris oversees AWS's security, threat management programs, and security policies. He's responsible for managing risk while aligning the company's security posture with business objectives. Chris joined AWS in August 2023 after holding security leadership roles at Apple, Capital One, Microsoft, and the National Security Agency. To Chris's left is Igor Tsyganskiy, the global CISO of Microsoft. Igor is responsible for the company's overall cyber defense, as well as advancing its Secure Future initiative. Before Microsoft, Igor served as the president and chief technology officer at Bridgewater Associates, where he held executive company-wide responsibility over all architecture development, technology, infrastructure, and data centers. And before Bridgewater, he led Database.com, a division of Salesforce, was a principal inventor and co-founder of Tea Leaf Technologies, and ran an advanced technology group at SAP. And on the screen with us is Phil Venables. Phil is the CISO of Google Cloud, where he leads the risk, security, compliance, and privacy teams. Before joining Google, he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, where he had multiple roles over a long career, initially acting as the firm's first CISO, a role he held for 17 years. Before Goldman, Phil had multiple CISO and senior engineering roles across a range of finance, energy, and technology companies. Again, thanks all of you for joining. Chris, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay.
On the topic of critical third-party regulation. In the financial sector, we've seen an increase in regulatory requirements on financial institutions' critical third-party providers, which include CSPs. In many ways, this puts financial institutions in the position of acting like the de facto regulator, as regulators hold us to account through our third-party risk management programs. So the question is, do we think this approach is effective, or can we get to a more efficient direction? And while I'll direct it to you, Chris, I'd invite others to chime in after Chris takes a swing.
Again, thank you for the invite. Really do appreciate being here in Philly, talking about cybersecurity. So this is a really fun, and as I think all three of us, actually all four of us, have all done both technology and cybersecurity roles in banking and technology companies. Like, this is a lot of fun to just get the right crew together. Right into the hard questions, huh? When I think about, so I'll give you a perspective from AWS. We have more than 300 different regulatory bodies that we talk to on a regular basis around the world, not counting customers that are, again, asked. I think it's very appropriate, and I think that the understanding that cybersecurity is critically important, that the risks involved affect our national security as well as consumers and individuals is also really, really important, and a big part of how we think about these problems. I'll tell you, I think one of the biggest and most important things is to achieve better regulatory harmonization. We lack enough sharp talent. We don't have the right people and the right scalability when we spend a lot of time talking together. Anecdotally, and I know, Pat, you and I have talked about this in the past, we have had regulators from different countries, and in some cases for me in the United States, that have given me explicitly opposite directions or guidance. And so I think in the United States alone, I have tens of regulatory sets of obligations. I think there's a ton of value for us to simplify. And I think that the firms should be able to depend where there's already regulatory review on that regulatory review to understand their risks. And so I think instead of the regulatory bodies asking the firms to conduct independent risk assessment. It would be much more valuable to have a limited set of in-depth risk assessments that the firms can take advantage of, so they can put their talent on solving cybersecurity problems and be able to draft off of those models.
And I just want to support that. Harmonization for us is a #1 issue as far as regulatory stuff is concerned, specifically harmonization around the world. EU is, I don't know how you guys deal with this, EU is coming up with a lot more cyber requirements over the next year. It's just a flood of requirements. And, for example, they come in and say things like, we'd like to be notified within 24 hours of a significant event, without providing the definition of a significant event, which might be very different than definition of a material event that SEC defines. And then those simple words create huge issues across. I had to live through that in the beginning of the year. We did a bunch of SEC notifications about some of the nation threat activity that was impacting Microsoft, and experiencing firsthand, seeing how legal teams react, seeing how we need to go and deal with different countries around the world. Sometimes it becomes an impossible task, and it worries me quite a lot.
Is there any, Chris, or Igor, Phil, feel free to chime in as well. Is there any specific mechanism for harmonization, a certification, particular rule, a particular framework that you all favor over another?
That's a great question. For me, I agree with you internationally. I would love to start just with the US, knowing that some of the international pieces are additional complexity. If we can at least get aligned in the US, I think that would be a great first step. I do worry about DORA and EU for the same reasons you mentioned. Within the US, I think FedRAMP may be the right place to start. FedRAMP doesn't cover every technology provider. There are some that do not sell to the federal government. I think that's okay. But for critical infrastructure roles like financial institutions, I think if we all invest in getting FedRAMP to be the program that we want it to be, we can achieve much better outcomes, much more scalably, allow institutions and regulatory bodies to spend their time and energy where they get the maximum impact, and get to a sense of consistency that I think helps us all achieve better security, because that's the end goal. It's to manage this risk better. So I would start with FedRAMP. I'm open to a different suggestion, but that's where I'd start, because I think it's the most mature of the programs.
Yeah, if I can just kind of weigh in. And first of all, apologies, everybody, I'm not there. And ironically, I'm here in Frankfurt, working with a number of banks and regulators on a lot of the topics we're talking about today from an EU perspective. But just to echo what Chris was saying, I'm building on on what Igor was saying before. I think there's a couple of things on regulatory harmonization. I think the other thing that we welcome appropriate direct regulation of us, rather than being regulated through our financial services customers. For the harmonization point, that sometimes we deal with a lot of misinterpretation and different opinions on on-site examination teams. And so one of the things, I think, a pathway to have less ambiguity for banks and less ambiguity for technology company providers, particularly cloud providers, is appropriate direct regulation. I actually think, I agree with Chris, I think FedRAMP is a reasonable basis for that, and I think having some consistency would be great. We deal with hundreds of regulators around the world, hundreds of certifications that we have to maintain, and having some degree of conformance to that to reduce the degree of ambiguity in how different interpretations by on-site examination teams happen. Everybody's trying to do the right thing. No criticism of anybody, but collectively, I think if we have less ambiguity, the better.
Phil, Pat, I'm curious. Thanks, Phil, by the way. I'm curious, what do you think? You get to sit as one of these financial institutions. I'm going to put this back on you.
Look, my perspective is I generally support, everything that you all have said, that we have sought, for quite some time, regulatory harmonization within the financial services sector. In fact, we have created a sector profile of the NIST cybersecurity framework and publicize that as a mechanism to drive more harmonization into how we are directly regulated. And I believe that while we have contractual means or economic means of trying to work with our third parties to get to a specific end, it may not be as effective on our end as direct regulation, and it may not be as clear on your end in terms of efficiency and how that's handled. And so generally agree with the direction of the conversation. Phil, let me come to you, change gears a little bit. Topic of concentration risk. While hyperscale cloud providers represent a growing dependency risk for many organizations, the financial sector already has significant concentration risk in card processing, payments, clearing, and beyond. So the question is, what can organizations partnering with CSPs learn, or where are the anti-patterns from what has existed within financial sector management of concentration risk today?
Yeah, so I think that the framing of your question is right to call out existing quite extensive concentration risks in the sector. You know, we shouldn't neglect those in our focus on cloud. And similarly, we shouldn't neglect the extensive concentration risks that already exist in on-premise IT. And we've seen this quite illustrated quite starkly with a number of repeated failures, including what happened with CrowdStrike a few months ago. We also see a huge amount of risk transmission possibilities in various identity providers, where there have been breaches as well as breaches of software as a service providers. So I think when we look at concentration risk and risk transmission vectors, we have to look at cloud, but beyond cloud as well. But yes, specifically hyperscale cloud providers, we've got a very significant role and responsibility to lead from the front as more of on-premise IT shifts to the cloud. And I think it's important to remember that cloud does, in fact, as many of you probably know, represent a quite a significant resiliency increase for many organizations. You know, in fact, you can look at the cloud. The way I look at the cloud is essentially a risk transformation engine that takes expected losses at the front of the curve and turns them into, albeit much decreased, but non-zero concentration risks in the tail. And as cloud service providers, we've all worked and continue to work pretty hard on various techniques to mitigate that concentration risk, particularly techniques like isolation, segmentation, progressive rollouts of updates in our infrastructure, independent control plane hardening and isolation. So as we make significant failures less and less likely, and in the same way, again, recognizing that I don't think anybody would claim there's ever a non-zero risk, making sure that if a failure does occur, that the blast radius is less and less and the recovery is faster and faster. But I think, again, with the partnership with customer organizations, we have to recognize that companies should plan potentially for some of their workloads to operate multi-cloud, or possibly plan to fail back to on-premise or fail over to another cloud. Most organizations already have multiple clouds that don't necessarily deploy single workloads portably across that. But all CSPs, all cloud service providers need to help customers with that, supporting things like data egress, driving a certain amount of the product set to be open source and open standards. And I think many of the other clouds have been working on these multi-cloud strategies. And in particular as well, being able, at Google Cloud, we deploy some of our products into the other clouds to permit that type of multi-cloud operation. The thing, though, it's important to remember, though, is that even if customers want to take advantage of some proprietary feature in a specific cloud to give them some edge, we should still kind of help them manage the resilience of that. The good news is, I think, fortunately in the financial sector, work from regulators like the PRA and the Fed have given us a great set of operational resilience frameworks to think about this. So I'll just give you one example before I close on this particular section. Is imagine an organization is using a proprietary database technology from a cloud provider, because that may have some unique capability compared to the others. Then if for whatever reason that fails for some hours or longer, it might be okay for the banking services that depend on that to pause while recovery occurs. It may not necessarily to be somehow active. It might be, though, that service is so critical it does need to continue to operate. But again, in our operational resilience language, it's acceptable for it to do so in a degraded state. perhaps being able to report transaction status, but not accept new transactions. And in that case, having a database snapshot on another cloud or on-premise system to permit that degraded function while the primary cloud comes back is probably fine. And so in this sense, as we look to manage concentration risk, I just remind ourselves of the leading nature of financial services and the financial services regulators in developing these operational resilience frameworks, because I think those are going to be usable to manage concentration risk.
You know, before I came to Microsoft, when I was at Bridgewater, one of the things that I had to deal with that some of you might be exposed to is Log4j, right? And it hit pretty much everyone equally across the world, across biggest banks, government organizations. And so what was it? It basically was, let's say, a vulnerability in an open source library that allowed attackers to take over parts of an organization. And the problem was there was no one to call. No one is responsible. Yes, it was open source. Great that it was open source. It was free, but there's a benefit of free that you don't pay money. The downside of free is that there's no one to call when something bad happens. And at that time, would I prefer to pick up a phone and call Google, call Amazon? We were one of the largest AWS customers, and we were like one of the largest Microsoft customers at the time and had some Google. Would I rather have 2 or 3 phone calls when I can pick up the phone, talk to a number of partners? And again, I'm mostly talking about cybersecurity, right? There's operational risk, there's many other risks. But from the standpoint of view of cybersecurity, I don't always buy into this notion of concentration risk. Because at the end of the day, who are we dealing with? From the other side, we're dealing with 2 classes of folks. We're dealing with, I call them modern pirates of 21st century, right? These are private organizations that go and want ransomware from us. Or we deal with nation states. And when we deal with nation states, by default, nation states are concentrated. You have to have some cross-coordinated response that requires tremendous amount of resources that most of the smaller companies do not have. So when you all think about concentration risk, it's a question of when is it beneficial and when it's not beneficial. And in case of cybersecurity, I think it's beneficial that there's risk involved. But we talk all the time on a constant basis about a bunch of different issues, and we can solve those problems and we can harmonize with each other when something bad happens. It is very, very hard to do when you have 700 companies, 800 companies, so forth and so on. So
I like both of your thoughts. I'd add one additional one is that I think we've got an advantage of all of these cloud products being relatively young and coming from a place when, from the earliest days of cloud, we had to convince companies, large companies, that it was better to and more resilient, safer, more stable to operate in our environments. And so, I recall talking to both of these, actually all of these folks when we were all in different jobs about issues related to cybersecurity and resilience, because we need that from our environments. I remember talking to my clouds at Capital One about how they're designing resilience in. And so I think a lot of the lessons that have come up even in the past 10 years from concentration risk are ones that get programmed into how we operate, how we design. As Phil talked about, having separable and segmented structure and so forth. And so I think there's nuance that's really important to pay attention to in concentration risk. First, do you want concentration? I think it's a good question, Igor. But the second piece is, how have the organizations designed in order to manage those risks? Because it's not simple enough to say, JPMC runs a bunch of really important services, there's a concentration risk. Well, yes, that's true, but you've spent how long designing to make sure that you can operate in spite of those risks? I think we've benefited from learning from those models, and I think we all need to continue to learn together. Right. But I think it's overly simplistic to say that concentration in any one particular company is risk in and of itself. I think it's much more important to have the nuanced dialogue about how you've designed to be resilient against those kinds of risks.
I think the notion of concentration in today's technology environment is inevitable. Software is delivered as a service or by platforms, and the best providers will have the most customers. And so I think just the notion of concentration risk is an inevitability that we can't structurally change. What we can do is plan for resilience as providers, resilience as users. Whether we get to a point of, specifically within the cloud, portability or simplicity of portability, I think is an open question, but it doesn't change the users' obligations to deliver resilient services to their customers.
And I want to note, again, different approaches may apply when you talk about operational risks, which I don't think the point of this panel is to talk about operations, versus cybersecurity risk. Right? In case of cybersecurity, like CrowdStrike, we mentioned CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike was not a security event; it was an operational event.
Okay,
well, I think interestingly,
go ahead, Phil.
A lot of the questions that come up on concentration risk are mostly about resilience, not necessarily about security. And I agree. I think sometimes we've got to balance. Certain things benefit from being concentrated and centralized. Other things, particularly associated with resilience to other types of events, benefit from being widely distributed and portable. But I agree with what you said, Pat, that we should always remember that, as I mentioned in my comments, the frameworks that we've got in the financial sector are much more advanced than many other sectors, and are continuing to build on what we've already done in the financial sector with operational resilience, I think is going to be the right answer to managing these concentration risks.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit again. Igor, I'm going to come to you first with this one. The topic is balancing innovation and security. So cloud service providers are feature-rich in supporting their customers like financial institutions and leading the way on topics like artificial intelligence. It is of critical importance to balance rapid innovation with robust security. So from your seat, how do you achieve this, specifically delivering security hygiene, modern defenses, reduction of legacy debt, as well as driving innovation?
Yeah, I've been definitely thinking a lot about this issue over the last couple of months, because you can take a company like Microsoft and you can tighten it up. You can regulate it. You can tighten it up to the point where we will be ultimately secure and never ship anything. And at the end of the day, innovation is what drives us forward. And sometimes innovating faster is in itself a security mechanism. So let's take AI as an example. If the rapid move to AI and the speed with which it will happen changes every 3-4 months, like right now, it's insane. Whatever we thought of as true a quarter ago will be different from a couple of months from now. We're on the verge of basically a new paradigm for the world to live in. Security-related stuff also changes quite a lot. And a lot of techniques that were absolutely relevant last year, from the security standpoint of view, won't be relevant next year. So the trick is to identify those things that don't change over time, tighten them up, make sure, frankly, across the board that the security hygiene is there, but also try to accelerate as much as possible core pieces of innovation to drive the threat actors. Like if we can convert this whole security thing into essentially a cyber game, where it's a software game, where it's on our territory, and we're just competing with another set of, software company, we can win, because the threat actor also needs to convert. Do they have the same number of GPUs available as we do? Probably not. Do they have state-of-the-art AI technologies? Well, we're leading there. As a nation, forget about Microsoft for a second. And so this cycle of innovation, in my opinion, is a security in itself, and speeding it up.
I agree. Change makes it hard for attackers. If you plan an attack and things have changed, that makes it a lot more difficult. I would add a few other, like I love that. There's a few other pieces that I think are critical. One is making sure that you've got the right methodology to make sure that you understand where the bar is and consistently shipping on the bar. The other thing that I think is really powerful that we all live is a degree of investment. Look, the reason we do security is trust. If customers didn't need to trust that their data was secure, that it couldn't be changed, that systems were available when they needed it, we wouldn't be doing security. We'd just be delivering software. Be fun. I wouldn't have a job. The reason we do it is trust, because trust is so important, and making sure that and it takes time to build, but making sure you've got a culture that is deeply invested in understanding the customers, what they need, and that trust is a critical part of what they ship is so important, because it's, frequent change is great. It provides a good tool. Making sure that change happens in a systematic, thoughtful way that continues to hit our security bars is incredibly important. So we need bars that help people move forward. And all of that gets underpinned by a culture that says, hey, my customers need to trust my product. Why banking exists. Customers need to trust your product. Same thing's true in security. And so that continuous investment, that understanding throughout the whole ecosystem takes continuous investment to build. Culture's hard. It takes time to build because culture is hard to build. It takes, but it pays dividends down the road. And so I think those are other key elements to how you think about that when you do security and innovation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I think as well, clearly innovating in security and moving fast and at the scale we can operate at can help impose costs and outpace attackers. But at the same time, very large tech companies also have an obvious responsibility when we're supporting tens or hundreds of thousands of companies and billions of end users in the case of some of our platforms. And in that moment of innovation, we have to make sure we're not just doing secure by design, we're doing secure by default to help customers and end users sustain a level of security. In some cases, we also then have to be quite careful with the innovation and not just throwing things out there into the market. We have to make sure that we're introducing technology with the safeguards built in, with privacy considerations built in, with security considerations built in. So while our desire is to innovate and drive speed, we should recognize that we're all walking a line, driving that speed while at the same time using technology where the right security design and security default choices have been made to benefit users and customers.
Very much agree, Phil. If I can add one more thought that I want to make sure I highlight in this is that is that secure by design and secure by default, but that means that you have to think not just about making sure that the underpinning services, the ones that we're all responsible are for secure. But what I loved about your point about secure by default is that we have to think about how do we make it easy for customers to use these services securely. Because if we miss that part, it's great if we built the underpinnings securely. That's the starting point. That's table stakes. But we have to make sure that we're thinking about how do we make it easier for customers to use the services securely, because otherwise we miss things. And so I loved how you talked about not just secure by design, making sure things are secure internally, but secure by default and making sure that we are really obsessing about those customers.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
I think that certainly we would agree from a customer standpoint. The reality is today it's still a range of options. Services are released, some of which are more secure than others, and it comes down to feature richness in terms of addressing certain customer sets. Whereas financial services customers may have a higher bar and may demand more security versus other customers that may be more commercial in nature that don't have the same obligations to their customers. I have a few sort of grab bag questions here, rapid fire, that I want to throw out, and perhaps go to the audience for questions if we have any. Maybe let me put one on the table. Anybody's free to jump in. It's on the notion of transparency, shared responsibility, and regulation. We've seen alternate ways to assess resiliency of firms in non-US jurisdictions from regulators. For example, penetration testing like CBEST or TBER, or engaging in active threat scenarios or discussions. So the question is, can and should US regulators engage in active testing exercises or scenario planning, in part to understand how firms respond, and perhaps in part in situations where we're leveraging cloud service providers to gain a better understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities during an incident?
Right. I would not mind it if there would be nationwide planning and a war game, where the nation is under attack and how all of us react together, driven by some regulator or an agency. I think it would be great if something like that would happen, right? And, and I don't know whether you agree or not, but my experience is I think finance sector is so much ahead of the rest of the industries from the standpoint of view of resilience. In some ways, finance has crises all the time. You're dealing with the market. And so there's the notion that somehow the nation is under attack, and banks, service providers, federal agencies somehow need to come together. I hope we do that more, not in a crisis mode, but in a planning mode.
I, for what it's worth, I love the idea of the exercises. I think we already do a number of those. We should keep on doing them and continue to improve. The active testing, I think there's already a bunch of work that goes on in the space. Boy, is that fun. I mean, having financial institutions test on top of our platform, excellent. We've got a number of services where we coordinate so that we know in advance not to activate and say, hey, you're being bad, we should go, stop your workloads and those kinds of things, and make sure that we're not being disruptive. But we've got a number of services where we support active testing of those services. Go through, test the APIs. One of the big programs we've got over the next year is to further increase that. One of the areas that I remain very thoughtful and sensitive about is the access to is making sure that we continue to ensure that just like we don't get access to internal data, nobody does. And a lot of active testing involves, depending on the country, things that they call leg ups or white cards, or providing access. And inside of production environments where you're running banks and healthcare institutions and a whole bunch of stuff, that's not appropriate. We don't do it. We've got other ways of testing, and similarly, we think it's important that that others don't do that as well. But I think there's a ton of testing that we already do and should continue to do in a really thoughtful way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think as well, there's a lot of value in pooled testing and pooled audits and pooled tests, so that it optimizes the workload of individual banks, as well as being able to enable us as cloud providers to take on tougher testing engagements that we couldn't do, one-on-one with individual organizations. Yeah, again, at the risk of being a broken record on this, I'd just encourage us to, as we do things like this and look to do things like this, use a lot of our existing constructs that we've already developed in financial services, like the FISIC, the FIBIC, the ISAC, the ARC, various other constructs. I think we've got, the good news is for financial services, we've got the coordinating apparatus to do this, and we should leverage that rather than creating something new.
Great, thanks. Let me offer the opportunity for questions from the audience. I have one more if there are no questions. If you just say it, I can repeat the question.
Okay, all right. I was wondering, very I would like to hear.
So the question for those listening remotely is with respect to concentration risk and how cybersecurity services are provisioned, such that, in a particular cloud provider, if there's an imbalance of customer adoption within a certain segment, region, or availability zone, are cybersecurity services provisioned in a biased way towards where that concentration is, or are cybersecurity services provisioned uniformly across the cloud control planes?
Thanks, Neha. Love the question. We do not. We look at the cloud not in terms of unit by unit, but we do look universally. And so I'm trying to think about how I would do that, but that's not the way we've designed. In terms of each availability zone, each region, but down to the availability zone, down to the data center level, gets focused cybersecurity and physical security attention. And so in some ways, yes, naturally you get a greater concentration of those resources where there's more availability zones, where there's more data centers. But that comes naturally as part of scale. That doesn't take a deliberate engineering effort to change the resources. But when I think about the volume of data that we get, I was talking to a number of different countries over the past year. We dwarf in terms of the amount of telemetry we get and process in near real time, sub 10 seconds, sub 20 seconds, what many countries get from all of their intelligence apparatus. It's absolutely amazing, the volume of data. So I think that happens naturally, just as part of how the system's architected, that because you're down to the system, the data center level, you automatically get more data. We don't have to steer, it just happens naturally.
And exactly the same thing. So first of all, it's important to note, again, separate cybersecurity risk away from operational risk. So in case of cybersecurity, you want to have uniform coverage across anything anything you're exposed to, because threat actor will not think about the fact that you have a lot of stuff in one spot. They just want to find any crack anywhere to pivot to wherever they need to get to. And that little crack might be somewhere in a zone where you are, under deployed. Doesn't really matter. Which is very different than operations, right? Because operations, if something crashes, it's not intentional in nature. And so you have to have 100% coverage of controls across the board. In order to do so, you have to have uniform coverage. So it's pretty much exactly the same thing. I think I will be surprised if someone, is different. It will be interesting.
I think everything... I think we'd probably deem it a failure mode if there had to be different deployments for different areas on cyber, because we spend an inordinate amount of time making sure that the security controls in the platform are consistent. The only kind of slight nuance I would go to, which is I'm not sure is what you meant in the question, but where a particular customer may be geographically constrained because of some data localization laws, we may have to help them provision extra capacity to consume their telemetry in that particular location. But generally speaking, everything is ruthlessly consistent because we have to make sure everything's designed into the platform by default.
Great. In the interest of time, I want to thank Chris, Igor, and Phil for joining us here today. And I will take responsibility for hosting an innovation panel without talking about AI. So you'll have to invite us back for another one there. Thanks, everybody, and thanks again to the Philly Fed for having us.